Hey everyone, so recently Square-Enix released a benchmarking tool for the upcoming PC version of Final Fantasy 15, and this is our first chance to go hands-on with the code and to see how well we can expect the game to run on our hardware. And this is a controversial one for sure, as Square-Enix has partnered up with Nvidia, and the game is packed with GameWorks enhancements. Yes, the notorious Hairworks is back. There's enhanced foliage via Turfworks, terrain tessellation, Nvidia Flow, and set for inclusion but not officially supported in the demo is Nvidia's own custom shadow solution and VXAO. Okay, so quite rightly, there's a lot of controversy surrounding GameWorks. Most of the technology does in fact run on AMD cards, but historically it doesn't do so very well. And the truth is that even on Nvidia hardware, a lot of this works stuff can indeed tank your frame rate. So I went into the Final Fantasy 15 benchmark tests with a few questions I wanted answers for. First of all, what is the general performance outlook right now for the game on both AMD and Nvidia hardware? Secondly, GameWorks. What kind of performance hit is there? And yes, finally, what is the actual visual gain you get from the GameWorks features in Final Fantasy 15? So here are the graphics cards I've chosen to get the job done. GTX 1060, the Founders Edition here, and the Radeon RX 580. I've got Sapphire's superb Nitro model here, but in the interests of like-for-like fairness, it has been limited to reference clocks. Mainstream 1080p PC hardware then, and I will indeed be testing them at full HD 1080p resolution. Now, when the game works properly and if you have the hardware to get the job done, you can enjoy this beautiful game at 60 frames per second according to the benchmark, and it looks sweet. The console versions aim for 4K display support, but do compromise on resolution, something you don't need to do on PC. You'll need a hefty piece of GPU hardware, but you can run this game in a playable state at 4K res. In short, we can use PC to power past the limitations of all of the existing console versions and tune the game exactly to our liking. But first up, let's talk about the quality presets I'm going to be testing. First up, there's the benchmark's high setting here, which I think has all of the game's standard settings ramped up and then adds most of the GameWorks stuff. Then there's the standard setting, which turns off GameWorks, pulls back level of detail, drops texture filtering from 8x to 4x, and drops shadow quality and indeed shadow distance. Now, I've used a custom launcher by Reddit user Dr. Daxi to introduce a third, non-standard setting, and it is enlightening. Essentially, it's identical to the high setting, but it turns off GameWorks completely. So let's kick off with some quality comparisons here. Now let's freeze frame on this opening scene right off the bat. This is on the max setting with GameWorks. Looks pretty sweet, but here's what happens when we strip out the Nvidia technology, all the other settings remaining the same. The ground loses some tessellated effects, and the foliage doesn't look quite as dense, whether it's the bushes at the top or the grass in the middle there. Dropping down to the standard setting, foliage takes another hit, and the ground starts to look a bit soupy there. So we do indeed have three distinct tiers of detail here. Now, as our heroes drive through the environment, let's stop and take a look at our three settings again. Here's everything maxed, a nice lush scene with expansive level of detail stretching into the distance. Now let's bring in the non-GameWorks version. In motion, that tessellated ground detail looks pretty much the same. Post-process motion blur seemingly eliminating the benefits of the GameWorks effect there. At distance, Turfworks also seems to lose some of its sheen. Yes, the foliage isn't as dense, but is it that much of a big deal? Meanwhile, level of detail remains highly impressive, and that's the key loss as we swap in the standard setting. The big losses here are shadow resolution and distance, pulled in LODs, and sparser foliage. Interestingly though, according to the INI files, the lighting precision and anti-aliasing quality in standard mode remain the same as the maxed out experience. Next up, Hairworks. Doesn't actually seem to be implemented on the chocobos here, or indeed the hair on the characters, which is kind of curious, but you can see a big difference with these bison-like creatures in this scene. But yeah, Hairworks, we'll have to return to that in a bit. Next scene, well, this actually looks pretty good for Turfworks. I think the point here is that you get a really nice effect with it close up, but it's perhaps less than impressive compared to the out-of-the-box effect when we pull out. Now, the combat scenes in the benchmark are dynamic and change from run to run. So yeah, not particularly good for comparison, though the summoning happens at the same point. But again, yeah, the results are different from run to run. So what's the takeaway then in terms of overall image quality? Well, clearly GameWorks is doing something, but the effectiveness of it varies from scene to scene, context to context. So the question is all about performance then, right? Well, first of all, I've measured everything here using FCAT, the gold standard for performance analysis, in that it's a deep dive read of the actual video output of the GPU. I've overlaid the FCAT frame rates and frame times over a nice smooth 60 frames per second feed of the benchmark I took using a 1080 Ti. But one thing I want to point out straight away is a kind of random stuttering effect that crops up from run to run. It's really not pretty, but let's have a quick look at in-the-moment performance on GTX 1060 here. Straight off the bat, in the initial scene, you'll see that GameWorks is hitting performance by around 12 frames per second. The difference between non-GameWorks high and standard is around 8 to 10 frames per second. Now, what's curious here is that the delta between GameWorks and no GameWorks only adjusts slightly when the Hairworks Buffalo are actually on screen. Now, I've put a link in the video description below to some work by Gamers Nexus that demonstrates pretty conclusively that Hairworks objects are being rendered in this first area of the benchmark even when they're not in view. And this is reflected in our results here, even in the fishing scene where there's very little difference between the three presets. From a visual perspective, GameWorks is incurring a 6 to 10 frames per second hit. But yeah, it's worth stressing that this is probably an implementation thing on the Square-Enix side rather than a dig at the Hairworks technology itself. After all, The Witcher 3's performance drops were very definitely context sensitive. However, I ran the same tests as Gamers Nexus here. High settings with no GameWorks, high settings with Turfworks, and high settings with Turf and Hairworks. The hit incurred by Hairworks, even when there are no on-screen instances of it, is clearly measurable, and it is significant. Now, you lose about 9% of performance with Turfworks engaged. And hey, that's kind of okay. After all, you are seeing a difference, you are getting a return. But this rises to a remarkable 21% with Hairworks active too, even though those bison-like creatures that are actually using the effect are only in view for around 15% of the duration of the benchmark we tested, which is effectively the first 2 minutes 20 of the entire run. Now, there is some good news here. Square-Enix has acknowledged that there's a level of detail issue here, and that will be fixed in the final game. And the smart money is on this, addressing the Hairworks problem as well. Okay, so let's move on. The combat scene here is dynamic and changes from run to run. So the preview image here is only indicative of one run, and you can't really compare them. They aren't exactly like for like, but the trend remains the same in terms of the performance data, and there are some pretty nasty frame times with GameWorks enabled. Even in the camping scene, which offers very little visual return from GameWorks, the hit to performance is still consistent. As for this scene here, well, no idea what could possibly explain the performance differential here. Now let's shift our focus and take a look at how the benchmark run operates using the Radeon RX 580. Straight off the bat, all three of my test runs here are exhibiting more stutter than the Nvidia equivalent. But this is just the beginning. Once we move into the driving scene, the hit incurred by GameWorks is simply colossal. Frame rate dips below 20 FPS there, and the frame times are obviously quite nasty. But check out the red and the cyan lines there. So long as GameWorks isn't active, things aren't so bad. I can't really explain the frame time variance on the green line there, but it kind of switches on and off throughout the driving section. It's really bizarre. Meanwhile, aside from occasional stutter, AMD holds up when the Nvidia effects are disabled. Performance tanks in the Hairworks area, but you'll note that I'm still getting nasty stutter even without it on both my other settings. Moving into the combat scene, and GameWorks once again causes massive problems here. And it's only the fact that I've had to expand the frame time graph to accommodate the super high times here that the bad stutter on the other settings doesn't look quite so bad. Now, I really hope that this is addressed because it looks really bad. And to be fair, the Final Fantasy XV Twitter account acknowledges the stuttering problem and says that it will be fixed. Going back to GameWorks though, it clearly incurs a big sustained hit to performance. At worst, it cripples the game. That too, I hope, is on the list of fixes. So we've looked at the Nvidia and AMD cards separately. Now let's stack them up head to head. Right now, GameWorks clearly isn't a good thing for AMD, and I honestly don't think it's fair comparing that preset. So let's look at the standard settings versus high, with none of Nvidia's tech active. AMD has more stutter, but overall the delta between the two cards and the two settings is pretty consistent. Assuming that AMD hasn't had much access to the code and doesn't yet have an optimized driver, well, the variance here isn't actually that bad. And let's remember that Final Fantasy 15 is at its heart a console game originally built around an engine that would have been designed around the AMD architecture. I'd say that there's plenty of potential here for Square-Enix to get this one right for PC users, though clearly there are still some trouble spots for AMD, and you can see that here in this combat section when the summoning kicks in. Nvidia actually has a 20 frames per second advantage here in like-for-like settings. Also note that while Nvidia can stutter here too, AMD frame times spike harder to the point where some of them are dropping out of the 80 millisecond range on the graph. So what's the takeaway here? Well, what I love about PC gaming is the idea of tweaking the experience for the right balance of performance and visual return. Square-Enix tells me that the benchmark shouldn't be seen as indicative of final performance, so I remain hopeful that the 580 and 1060 will see appreciable boosts. I still don't quite understand what the point of this benchmarking system is though. Settings adjustments are locked, requiring a hack to make them accessible, and that number in the bottom left is essentially equivalent to the average frame rate multiplied by 100. But, overall it makes very little sense to the user. Yeah, we've put together some media with the game locked to 1080p 60 and 4K 30 with our best efforts at eliminating the judder, and it does look pretty awesome. So I'm remaining hopeful for this one, but the GameWorks implementation here is not good, and I'm not completely sold on the visual returns. Meanwhile, AMD performance is dreadful right now with those features active. Okay, so perhaps that's to be expected. But look at it from another perspective. If I own a Radeon card and Nvidia is trying to sell me on their cool technology, well, this isn't a great advert, is it? And if I own a GTX card and GameWorks is tanking performance with limited visual return, again, I've got to ask you, is this good for the GeForce brand? Okay, well, that's where I'm going to leave things right now. I'm still looking forward to seeing this game in all of its glory once it's finished, even though I expect it to be rather demanding on our hardware. With the release so close though, I'm hoping for better performance across the board for both AMD and Nvidia users. Anyway, I hope you found this interesting. If you did, please like and subscribe and consider supporting the Digital Foundry Patreon if you like the work we do and want to support it. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for watching.